I've spent 34 years reading the dirt. I can tell you exactly what a man's footprints look like when he realizes he's no longer the apex predator. When a guy is just hiking, his stride is even and predictable. But when he's being hunted, the heel digs in deep, driven by pure primal terror. I've seen those tracks way more times than I care to admit. I'm a boundary tracker out here in the high desert, patrolling where the paved roads end. For decades, my job's been to find the folks who wander way too far past the warning signs. Usually I just find them dehydrated and humbled by the desert. But there's a third category we don't write about in the official reports. Sometimes I'm tracking someone who deliberately crossed into places they were warned to avoid. These are places where the old rules of the world still apply. Places where ancient things born of human greed and dark medicine still walk among the shadows. This is the log of the longest 3 days of my life. It's the reason I no longer patrol the northern boundary after dusk and why I'm warning you. The call came in on a cold Tuesday morning in late October. Tribal police found an abandoned truck parked at the mouth of a deeply isolated box canyon. We call it Blackwood Wash, and it's totally off-limits to the public. It's a maze of unstable sandstone and ancient cliff dwellings our elders declared strictly forbidden. The truck belonged to a guy named Julian. He was a smart guy, but after he lost his police badge, he fell into heavy debt and started poaching artifacts. Before crossing that tree line, I made sure I had my gear right. Grabbed my pack, my rifle, and this little leather pouch my grandpa gave me. It was full of white ash and dried cedar. I carried it for 30 years out of respect, never thinking I'd actually need it. I picked up Julian's trail right past those old warning signs. He was wearing heavy hiking boots, digging deep into the sand and clay. The guy was moving fast and confident. He had a heavy pack on, heading straight into the narrow throat of the canyon. I tracked him for the first 6 miles without much trouble. But by mid-afternoon, those canyon walls started closing in tight. They shot up hundreds of feet, completely blocking out the sun. It threw the whole canyon floor into this deep, permanent twilight. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a matter of minutes. All the normal desert sounds just faded away. No birds, no lizards in the brush, nothing. It was replaced by this heavy, oppressive silence that made the air feel thick. Right around mile 8, the story in the dirt started to change. I found a spot where Julian stopped to rest by a large boulder. But about 30 yards away, hidden behind some scrub oak, I found something else. And that's when a cold knot formed in my stomach. I knelt down and studied a second set of tracks. They were canine, but impossibly huge, pressed deep into the dirt. Whatever left them was way heavier than any natural wolf. And they were walking in a straight line, right on 2 legs. This thing had stood perfectly still behind the brush, just watching Julian. I stood up slow, my hand dropping right to my rifle. I scanned the shadows, but the silence was absolute. Every instinct I had was screaming that I was being watched. I looked back at Julian's tracks leaving that spot. His confident walk was totally gone. The toes dug deep into the sand, and his strides got longer. Julian realized he wasn't alone out there, and he started to run. I kept going, but I moved a lot slower now. I spent more time watching the ridges than looking at the dirt. The canyon twisted like a dying snake. By the time the sky turned a bruised purple, the shadows were taking over. I finally found Julian's first camp tucked under a massive rock overhang. But this wasn't a camp meant for resting. His tent was thrown up frantic, stakes driven in at crazy angles. There was no fire ring, just a guy trying to hide in the dark. I approached the tent real careful. The nylon door was unzipped, just flapping in the cold draft. Inside, his sleeping bag was all tangled and twisted up. Looked like he'd been thrashing around in a blind panic. His heavy pack was slumped in the corner. I dragged it out into the fading light and opened it up. I was hoping to find some clue about where he went, or at least figure out what kind of shape he was in. Under some spare clothes, I found what he came for. It was a bundle wrapped tight in an old moving blanket. I carefully peeled it back. Inside was a stash of ancient, beautifully preserved artifacts. 2 pristine clay pots, polished turquoise beads, and a bone flute. Julian had broken into a sealed burial site. He disturbed the dead out of sheer, stupid greed. He crossed a line you just don't cross out here. Tucked in a side pocket, I found a weather-beaten leather notebook. It was Julian's survival log. I opened it to the last few pages. You could see his handwriting shift from neat to completely frantic. I put my back against the rock and started reading. His first entry was from Sunday. He bragged about finding the site and prying the stones loose. He even wrote about blowing that bone whistle. By Monday morning, his handwriting was getting shaky. He wrote that the canyon went dead quiet overnight. He looked out and saw something moving on the ridge. He said it looked like a dog, but way too tall. Monday evening's entry was a chaotic scrawl. He realized it wasn't a wolf and it was walking on 2 legs. He tried to ambush it from a ledge. That's when he saw it wearing a wolf skin. He aimed his rifle, but his hands were shaking too bad to shoot. The thing stopped right below him and looked up. He said it had a human face, but completely white eyes. It just smiled, and he ran. The final entry was smeared with dirt and sweat. It wouldn't let him leave, herding him deeper into the wash. Then it started talking in the dark. It was perfectly mimicking his ex-wife's voice, begging him to come out. I closed the notebook, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the abandoned pack and those stolen artifacts. Julian hadn't just angered a spirit. He summoned a predator that feeds on fear. A chilling realization washed over me. The creature had herded Julian and completely broken his mind. By focusing so hard on finding him, I walked straight into its web. I was the new prey. I stood up immediately. It was way too dark to hike out now. If I used a flashlight, I'd just be a glowing target in the pitch black. I had to hold my ground. I grabbed my pack and my rifle. I left Julian's bag and those cursed artifacts exactly where they were. I didn't want any part of that bad medicine. I stepped out into the wash. I moved about 50 yards down the wash, scanning the rock walls. I found a narrow crevice that formed a natural V-shape. It was easily defensible. Nothing could sneak up on me from behind. I gathered as much dry sagebrush and deadwood as I could find. I had to work fast before the last of the light vanished. I kept listening for any sound out there in the dark. I built a fire right at the mouth of the crevice. The flames caught and cast this flickering orange glow. It gave me warmth, but mostly it was my only light against the pitch black. I sat down with my back pressed hard against the rock. I loaded a round into the chamber of my rifle and laid it across my knees. I just stared out into the darkness. Then I took out the small leather pouch my grandfather gave me. I untied it and poured a handful of white ash and dried cedar into my palm. I could feel the weight of tradition. I drew a thick, unbroken line of ash across the opening. The old men say a skinwalker can't cross blessed ash unless you invite them in. So I sat back, and I waited. For the first couple hours, it was just the fire crackling and this heavy, suffocating silence. The dark out there was absolute, like a solid wall pressing right up against me. I kept my eyes locked on the tree line, just waiting to catch a glimpse of something moving. Right around midnight, the temperature just completely dropped out. Every breath I took hung in the air like thick white smoke. The fire started burning low, and the shadows started playing tricks on my eyes. I leaned forward to toss another branch on the coals, and that's when the smell hit me. It rolled into the rocks like a physical fog. It was this awful mix of rotting meat, stagnant water, and old copper. The stench was so intense it actually made my eyes water and my stomach turn. I had to pull my jacket sleeve up over my nose just to breathe. My other hand grabbed the rifle, holding on so tight my knuckles went white. Then the mind game started. I heard this low, wet, crunching sound out in the pitch black, maybe 40 yards out. It was the heavy, unmistakable sound of boots walking on dry gravel. The footsteps were slow, totally deliberate. Whatever it was, it just started pacing back and forth right on the edge of the firelight. Crunch, 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 just taunting me in the dark. I brought my rifle up and stared down the sights, my heart practically beating out of my chest. But there was absolutely nothing to shoot at. The darkness out there just swallowed the light whole. Then the footsteps just stopped. That dead silence came rushing back for a few agonizing seconds. Honestly, the quiet was almost worse than hearing it walk. And then a voice called out from the dark. It said my name. It was Julian's voice, and my blood just turned to ice. But it sounded flat and hollow, like a cheap tape recording with zero emotion. It told me it was hurt, that its leg was broken and it needed help. I squeezed my eyes shut and dug my nails into my palms until I felt pain. I knew the old rules. You never, ever answer it back. The voice didn't stop. It shifted, sounding a little more desperate, a little more human. It kept begging me to come out of the rocks. Said it was freezing and couldn't walk. I just stared straight ahead, locking my eyes on the flames. I started muttering a quiet, traditional prayer under my breath, just repeating the words over and over to ground myself. I wasn't going to let the panic take hold. Then, just like that, the voice stopped. Whatever was out there realized Julian's voice wasn't working on me. This thing was smart. It was actively testing my defenses, looking for the right key. For 10 agonizing minutes, it was dead silent. Then a new sound crept out of the dark. It wasn't a voice this time. It was the sound of a woman crying, echoing off the walls. It was a sound perfectly designed to trigger every protective instinct. I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw ached. I knew it was a trick. I knew for a fact I was the only human left out here. But then the crying just stopped, and a new voice spoke from the shadows. Dad, Dad, I'm scared. It's dark. My heart physically stopped for a second. The rifle actually slipped in my hands. It was my youngest daughter, Maya's voice. She was 200 miles away, safe in her bed. I knew that with every logical fiber of my being. But the voice was flawless. She called out again, asking why I wouldn't come get her. She said there was a big dog out there looking at her. A wave of nausea and pure terror hit me so hard I felt dizzy. The urge to run out into the dark to protect my kid was overwhelming. It felt like a physical force pulling at my limbs. Without even thinking, my boot shifted in the dirt. I stopped myself just in time. I squeezed my eyes shut and bit down hard on the inside of my cheek. That sharp, sudden pain grounded me. It snapped me right out of the creature's trance. I told myself it wasn't her. I whispered out loud that it was just a shadow, just a trick trying to pull me into the dark. I had to believe it. The second I spoke, the imitation of my little girl vanished. Instead, this deep, guttural laugh echoed out of the pitch black. It sounded like a coyote choking on a bone. It knew it had almost broken me, and it was mocking me. Suddenly, this massive shape moved right at the edge of the firelight. It was incredibly fast, just a blur. It rushed the mouth of my crevice and stopped dead just inches from the ash line. I jerked backward, bringing my rifle up with my finger heavy on the trigger. For the first time, I saw it clearly in the dying firelight. It was crouched on all fours, but its limbs were way too long, bent at these impossible, agonizing angles. It wore a massive wolf pelt, but the body underneath was horribly human. Its face was pulled back into this permanent, terrifying grin, and its eyes were completely white and glowing. It just stared at me, tilting its head to the side like some kind of curious bird. I watched its rib cage expand as it breathed in deep, literally tasting my fear. Then it reached this long, pale hand forward. Its thick, jagged nails hovered just millimeters above the white ash. It was testing the boundary, begging me to panic and shoot. I held my breath and didn't move a single muscle. I kept the rifle pointed right at its chest, even though I knew bullets wouldn't do a thing to stop it. My only real weapon was my discipline. We stayed locked like that for what felt like an eternity. It was crouching there, grinning, and I was sitting perfectly still, praying silently. Finally, it let out this low, frustrated hiss. Sounded exactly like air escaping a punctured tire. Then, real slow, it pulled its hand back from the ash line. It stood up, rising to nearly 7 feet tall. That massive wolf pelt draped over its shoulders like some kind of twisted cape. It just towered over me in the firelight. It looked down at me one last time, and that horrible grin somehow got even wider. Those glowing white eyes just bored right through me. It was pure, sadistic mockery. Then it just turned away. It melted seamlessly right back into the pitch-black darkness of the canyon. Slowly, that awful stench of rotting meat started to fade out of the air. Even with it gone, I didn't move a single muscle. I kept my rifle raised and locked. I wasn't about to risk reaching out to throw more wood on that dying fire. I sat there perfectly still, eyes wide open, for hours. The cold was biting right into my bones, but I held my ground. I just waited until the sky finally turned a pale gray. When the first rays of morning sun finally hit the canyon floor, the normal desert sounds came back. That's when I finally let myself take a long, shaky breath. My whole body was rigid, muscles cramping up from hours of being locked in place. I stood up real careful, making absolutely sure my boots stayed clear of that ash line. I stepped out of the rocks and into the morning light. The canyon was quiet again, but it was a normal quiet. The air just smelled like dry dust and sagebrush again. I walked over to where the thing had been standing. The ground was completely torn up. Massive, deep footprints circled the whole front of my camp. It had paced there all night, just waiting for me to break. I didn't bother going back to Julian's camp. I knew for a fact he was already dead. That thing used his voice, which meant it had taken him. The canyon claimed him as the price for his greed. I turned around and started the grueling hike back to the wash. I moved fast, keeping a relentless pace. I promised myself I wouldn't look back. I just kept my eyes locked on the path ahead. I kept my eyes fixed on the distant opening of the wash. I just wanted to get back to my truck and the paved road. The canyon twisted and turned for miles, but that heavy, suffocating feeling was finally gone. When I finally reached the police barricade, those officers looked at me like I was a ghost. I was covered in red dust and couldn't stop shaking. They rushed over and asked if I'd found Julian. I looked at the lead officer, this young kid who still thought the world was black and white. I thought about Julian's journal and those glowing white eyes. I thought about hearing my own daughter's voice in the dark. I told him Julian suffered a fatal fall while climbing a loose shale ridge. I said the rock gave way and buried him under tons of rubble. I told them it was too dangerous to attempt a recovery. The officer just nodded slowly and wrote it all down on his clipboard. He didn't even question me. I was the veteran tracker out here, so my word was basically law. They accepted the story without a second thought. They closed Blackwood Wash permanently right after that day. They put up heavy steel gates and called it a federal hazard zone. That was the official story. But the night trackers, we all know the real truth. I still track out here. I still find lost hikers who underestimate the desert's sun. But I've got strict rules now. I absolutely do not track past sunset anymore. And I never go into those deep box canyons. If I ever find a footprint that's too large or a track that shifts from a boot to a paw, I just walk away. I'm sharing this because people are forgetting the old warnings. They think the wild is just a playground. People look at these vast, empty spaces on the map and just see a playground. They think it's a spot for a weekend adventure, or worse, a place to exploit. They completely ignore the old warnings. They walk into the deep canyons armed with GPS, expensive gear, and a dangerous amount of arrogance. They really believe their modern tools make them invincible out here. It's a fatal mistake. But the wilderness doesn't care about your technology. It doesn't care about your bravery or how much money you dropped on your gear. This desert is an ancient, indifferent force. There are things out there that have existed long before the first roads were ever paved. Things that feed on broken taboos and the corruption of the human spirit. They wait in the places we were told never to go. They're incredibly patient. They're highly intelligent. And they are always hungry. They just watch from the shadows, studying every move you make, waiting for you to slip up. If you're ever out in the remote wild, miles from civilization, pay close attention. If you notice the canyon has gone completely silent, you're in immediate danger. That means something is hunting. If you suddenly smell a sickening scent rolling in like a fog, a mix of old copper and rotting sage, That's the smell of the predator closing in on you. If you hear the voice of a loved one calling out from the darkness, begging for help, if they're telling you to leave the safety of your fire, you've got to resist every instinct you have. Do not answer them. Don't try to be a hero out there. Draw your line in the ash, hold your ground, and just pray for the dawn to come. Because once you step into the dark to find them, you'll realize too late that you aren't the apex predator anymore. You're just the next meal. The wilderness always wins. I still drive the perimeter every single day. It's quiet out here, but it's a heavy kind of quiet. The kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. They put up those massive steel gates at Blackwood Wash, slapped a federal hazard sign on it, and called it a day. Like that's gonna fix anything. But a piece of metal isn't gonna stop what's living down in that dark. It really just keeps the honest folks out. The things that belong to the canyon don't care about our fences. Every now and then, the wind shifts just right. And you catch that smell. That rotting copper stench that just coats the back of your throat. I keep my grandfather's pouch on me at all times now. I don't even step out of the truck without it. It's the only thing standing between me and the dark. The desert looks so peaceful when the sun's high. You'd never guess what wakes up when it goes down. It's a beautiful lie we all just kinda accept. But people still don't listen. Just last week, I found a fresh set of boot prints, heading right past the barricade into the wash. Nice, even strides. Someone looking for a thrill, or maybe looking to make a quick buck. They have no idea what's already tracking them. I didn't follow them. I just turned my truck around and drove back to the station. I don't cross that line anymore. Because once the sun dips below that ridge, the rules change. And out here, the desert always collects its debts. You just gotta make sure it's not your turn to pay. I tracked Julian for the first 6 miles without much trouble. He was moving fast, hauling a heavy pack based on his heel strikes. But by mid-afternoon, those canyon walls closed in tight. They blocked out the sun, leaving the wash in a heavy twilight. Around mile 8, the story in the dirt started to change. I found a spot where Julian stopped to catch his breath. He left a scuff mark on a boulder where he dropped his pack. By then, the normal desert sounds had faded into a heavy silence. About 30 yards from where he rested, I found a second set of tracks. They looked canine, but they were impossibly huge and pressed deep into the hard dirt. My blood ran cold when I saw the pattern. They didn't stagger like an animal on 4 legs. They were walking in a straight, 2-legged line. I stood up real slow, my hand dropping right to the grip of my rifle. I scanned the dark cracks in the sandstone and the thick juniper bushes. The silence was absolute. I felt that undeniable primal gut feeling that something was watching me. I kept going, moving a lot slower now. I spent more time checking the ridges than looking at the dirt. Julian's tracks showed he knew he wasn't alone anymore. His stride got longer, like he was starting to panic and hurry. By the time the light faded, I found Julian's camp tucked under a massive rock overhang. It wasn't a camp meant for resting. His tent was thrown up haphazardly, stakes driven in at crazy angles. There was no fire ring, just a terrified man trying to stay hidden in the dark. I walked up to the tent real careful. The door was unzipped, just flapping in the canyon draft. Inside, his sleeping bag was all twisted up, like he'd been thrashing around in a panic. His heavy pack was just sitting there in the corner, totally abandoned. I dragged the pack out into the fading light and opened it up. Under some spare clothes, I found a bundle wrapped in an old moving blanket. I peeled it back and saw what he came here for. Pristine, ancient artifacts and a flute carved right out of bone. Julian had busted into a sealed burial site out of pure greed. Tucked in a side pocket next to the artifacts, I found a small, beat-up leather notebook. It was his survival log. The pages inside documented his quick slide into absolute terror. I sat down with my back hard against the canyon wall, keeping my eyes on the wash. As the last bit of daylight bled out of the sky, I opened his journal. His handwriting started out neat and cocky, but it quickly turned into these jagged, frantic scrawls. His first entry was from Sunday, the day he got there. He wrote about finding the cliff dwelling and prying the stones loose. He found the pots and that bone whistle, and he actually blew it just to see if it worked. Said the hollow sound echoed through the whole canyon. By Monday morning, his handwriting was already getting shaky. He woke up in the middle of the night because the canyon went completely dead quiet. He looked out of his tent and saw something up on the ridge. He thought it was a stray dog, but it stood way too tall. Monday evening's entry was just a frantic, heavy scrawl. He realized it wasn't a wolf because it was walking on two legs. He tried to double back and ambush it from a ledge. But when he finally saw it, his hands were shaking so bad he couldn't even pull the trigger. He wrote that it was wearing a wolf pelt, but the thing underneath was pale and twisted. It stopped right below his ledge and looked up at him. He said it had a human face, but the eyes were completely white. It smiled at him, and Julian just ran. His final entry on Tuesday was barely readable, smeared with dirt and sweat. The thing wouldn't let him leave, herding him deeper into the wash. That night, it started talking to him from right outside the tent. It perfectly imitated his ex-wife's voice, begging him to come out. He knew it was a trick, but the voice was just too perfect. He wrote that he was leaving the pack and making a run for the high ridge. His last words were a warning. The old stories aren't just myths, they're rules to keep us alive. I closed the notebook, my heart just hammering against my ribs. I looked at the stolen artifacts and then out into the pitch-black canyon. Julian didn't just anger a spirit. He summoned a predator that feeds on fear, and it swallowed him whole. But then a much colder realization washed over me. I had tracked Julian perfectly, but the creature had tracked him too. Skinwalkers are smart, sadistic hunters, and they take their time. I had walked straight into the center of its web. I wasn't the tracker anymore. I was the new prey. I stood up immediately. It was way too dark to hike out through all those rocks, so I had to hold my ground until morning. I grabbed my rifle and left Julian's cursed bag exactly where it was. I moved down the wash, looking for a spot where nothing could sneak up behind me. I found a narrow, V-shaped crevice in the rock and built a small fire at the opening. Then I took out the small leather pouch my grandfather gave me. I poured the white ash and dried cedar into my hand, and I drew a thick, unbroken line in the dirt right behind the fire. I sat back against the rock and just waited. For the first 2 hours, it was nothing but the crackle of the fire and this suffocating silence. The darkness beyond the firelight was absolute, like a solid wall pressing in on me. Around midnight, the temperature just plummeted. My breath plumed in the freezing air. As I reached forward to toss another branch on the coals, I smelled it. It rolled into the crevice like a physical fog, smelling of rotting meat and stagnant water. The stench was so intense it made my stomach heave. I covered my face with my sleeve and gripped my rifle tighter. Then the auditory assault began. It started as a low, crunching sound out in the darkness. Heavy boots stepping on dry gravel, pacing back and forth. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, pacing just beyond the firelight. I raised my rifle and peered down the sights, but there was nothing to shoot at. Just impenetrable blackness. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence returned for a few agonizing seconds, and then a voice called out from the dark. It called my name. My blood turned to ice because it was Julian's voice. But it wasn't right. It sounded flat and hollow, like a recording played through a cheap speaker. It said he was hurt, that his leg was broken, and begged me to come help him. I closed my eyes and dug my fingernails into my palms. I knew the rules. You don't answer and you don't engage. If you speak to it, you acknowledge its power. The voice shifted, sounding a little more desperate, begging me to come out of the rocks. I stared straight ahead, focusing on the flames. I muttered a quiet, traditional prayer under my breath to ground myself. I refused to let the panic take hold. The voice stopped. The creature realized Julian's voice wasn't working. It was testing my defenses, looking for the right key to unlock my terror. For 10 minutes, there was total silence. Then, a new sound emerged from the darkness. It was the sound of a woman crying. Soft, muffled sobs echoed off the canyon walls. It was a sound designed to trigger every protective instinct a man possesses. But I just gritted my teeth. But then the crying stopped, and a new voice spoke. It said, "Dad, I'm scared. It's dark." My heart physically stopped for a second, and the rifle slipped in my hands. It was my youngest daughter's voice. I knew for a fact she was 200 miles away, safe in her bed. I knew it with every logical fiber of my being, but the voice was perfect. It had her exact cadence and that slight lisp she gets when she's tired. She asked why I wouldn't come get her, saying there was a big dog out there. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror hit me so hard I felt dizzy. I stopped myself. I squeezed my eyes shut and bit down on the inside of my cheek hard. The pain grounded me and snapped me right out of the trance. I whispered to myself that it wasn't her. It was just a shadow. The second I spoke, the creature reacted. My daughter's voice vanished, replaced by this sudden, terrifying laugh. It was this deep, guttural bark, kind of like a coyote choking on a bone. It was pure mockery. It knew it had almost broken me. Suddenly, this massive shape moved at the edge of the firelight. It rushed toward the crevice, stopping just inches from the ash line. I jerked back and raised my rifle. For the first time, I saw it clearly in the flickering light. It wore a massive wolf pelt draped over a body that looked horribly human. Its skin was the color of old chalk, stretched tight over its bones. The face was pulled back into this permanent, horrifying grin. It had completely white eyes that glowed in the dark. It reached a long, pale hand forward. Its jagged nails hovered just millimeters above the line of white ash. It was testing the boundary, wanting me to panic and break the line. I held my breath and didn't move a muscle. I kept the rifle pointed right at its chest. My only real weapon was my discipline. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the creature let out a low, frustrated hiss. It slowly pulled its hand back and stood up to nearly 7 feet tall. It looked down at me one last time, its grin widening. Then it turned and melted seamlessly back into the pitch-black canyon. I sat perfectly still until the sky finally turned a pale gray. When the first rays of sunlight hit the canyon floor, I finally exhaled. I stepped out of the crevice into the morning light. The ground outside was completely torn up. Massive, deeply gouged footprints circled the mouth of my camp. I didn't bother going back to Julian's camp. I knew with absolute certainty that he was dead. When I finally hiked back to the police barricade, I told them he suffered a fatal fall. I said he was buried under tons of rubble and it was too dangerous to recover him. They didn't question me. They closed Blackwood Wash permanently after that day. They put up heavy steel gates and called it a federal hazard zone. I still track lost hikers, but I have strict rules now. I never track past sunset, and I don't enter the deep box canyons. If I see a footprint that's too large, I turn around and walk away. The wilderness doesn't care about your technology or your bravery. There are ancient things out there that feed on the corruption of the human spirit. If you're ever in the remote wild and hear a loved one calling from the dark, do not answer them. Draw your line in the ash, hold your ground, and pray for the dawn. Because once you step into the dark, you're no longer the apex predator.